Hello and good afternoon. Welcome back to another episode of the Blue Bookmark. Today I am joined by a very special guest, Martha Waters. Hi, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, I have a funny story of how I originally discovered you. Your second book had just come out, and I saw the cover, and it was so cute that it immediately caught my eye. And so then I realized it was a sequel. So I had to order the first book, and then I read them both in like 2 days.
That's always the best compliment.
Yeah. And then I think I saw on Instagram where you answered someone's question and was like, well, as of now, it's just these two. There's not a third. And then I see a third, and I was like, yes.
I know we've always ended up announcing that there's going to be a next one like really close before publication. So a lot of people have like read an arc of the preceding one and been like, "What's next?" And I'm like, I can't tell you anything yet.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about you.
So I am a children's librarian. I'm originally from South Florida. I went to college in North Carolina. I just moved to Maine last year, so just inching my way up the eastern seaboard.
Yeah. Maine is like my dream retirement state. Like I will get there one day.
It's cold.
I'm from Kentucky, and it's 90 degrees today, so I'm
I know. I'm at the time of year where I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like a little salty because if I was in North Carolina still, it would be absolutely beautiful spring weather and it's still kind of chilly up here. But on the other hand, it would also be swelteringly hot in like 2 weeks in North Carolina, whereas it's going to be lovely here probably in May. So I'm trying to cling to that thought because it was a long winter.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I originally wanted to write for like kids and teens and stuff. But when I was in library school getting my degree, I had to read a book. We had to read a different genre each week for a class I was taking. And I read a historical romance for our romance week. And I like fell in love with the genre. And that was sort of what inspired me to like sort of switch gears from trying to write for like a younger audience to wanting to write for adults and wanting to try to write a romance novel. And that first attempt turned into my first book. So, and the rest is kind of history.
I love that. Well, then you kind of answered my second question about, inspiration. So you read some historical. So specifically though, where did you pull your inspiration for these characters?
So I feel like the whole series kind of came about because of like a long-standing like inside joke with my friends. Like the very first book is sort of a like Regency version of the "They don't know, we know, they know, we know" episode of Friends.
Loved that.
Where the heroine is like faking a case of consumption, and the whole like this is all based on a joke I had with my friends about consumption being the most romantic way to die. But when I was writing that book, like I immediately knew they had to have like a big cast of like friends to kind of be like, what are you guys doing? This is insane. And so as soon as I started writing this whole friend group, I just like fell in love with all the side characters so much that I knew I wanted to give them all their own stories. And they kind of like wrote them, like, I mean, like the characters kind of wrote themselves in the first book. Like all the side characters had such distinct personalities. So it was really easy for me to write To Love and to Loathe, the second book, about two characters who kind of like stole the scene anytime they were on page together. And then To Marry and to Meddle, the new one, is about two characters who were both on page in the first two books. And the minute I had them in a scene together in the first book, I knew I wanted to like give them a story. It was more just sort of a matter of figuring out like what that story was going to look like exactly. But yeah.
I like how they're all a little bit different tropes too. And then like the first book, as somebody who's married, I don't see a lot of already married people with their issues. And so that's always fun to read.
Yeah, I really love Marriage in Trouble as a trope. And one of the first historical romance authors that I read a bunch of, oh, that was my cat. By was Eloisa James, and she, I feel like, has, oh my gosh.
Kitty cat.
She like never displays any interest in anything I'm doing at my desk until I am
you're doing something. Yeah.
So Eloisa James, I feel like, has written a weirdly large number of Marriage in Trouble books, and she was a very early author that I was reading when I was first dipping a toe in the genre. And so I thought this was like a really, really common trope, and I was like, oh, I really like it because it's so interesting since they sort of like have this shared history and already know each other so well. I feel like it's a really fun dynamic. And then as I continued reading the genre, I realized it actually isn't that common of a trope. She just writes a lot of them, but by that point, I'd like fallen in love with it. And so I really like immediately knew I wanted to write Marriage in Trouble for my first book. And then everything since then has just kind of been me. But well, having to figure out like what tropes worked with like the specific characters, but also just like what are my favorite tropes and like how can I kind of put my own spin on them. And it's been really fun.
Yeah, so there's 2 more characters that I'm hoping that you do. So West, I feel like he totally needs, and then I cannot remember her name, but the one that in the second book that she was trying to get him set up with.
Oh, Lady Helen.
Yes. I'm like, I feel like she has some potential there.
So I'm not planning on writing a book for her. I'm trying to work out a way to work because there's gonna be 2 more books in the series.
Yay.
And I'm trying to figure out a way to like work in some kind of, probably not in the 4th one, which I'm like on deadline for right now to do on Friday. So I was almost finished the draft on that one. So I don't think it'll be in that one. I'm hoping in the 5th one I'll be able to like work in some sort of like reference to her where it becomes clear that she is living happily ever after her retiring.
Good.
Yeah. But so the 4th book is about Penvale, who's the brother of Diana, the second one, and is best friends with all the characters from the first 3 books. And the 5th one is about West and Sophie, which I've not even started writing yet. So
it'll write itself, right?
I hope
so. So being from the United States, where did you kind of do your research on Regency-ish life?
So I was a history major in college, and my focus was like modern European history. And I took several classes about British history. And I also am just like a lifelong Anglophile. So I felt like I had read so much, both like nonfiction and fiction set during this era that before when I started writing my first book, especially because I don't know, like my intention with writing these books is for them to sort of feel sort of deliberately a bit modern and also sort of deliberately kind of like they're responding more to the like tropes of the genre and sort of the like standard things you find in romance and our like fictionalized idea of what the Regency is more than they're actually responding to Regency history. So I wrote the first one without doing any research, which of course I spent like half the book like having to highlight stuff, being like, look this up, because I would stumble upon like knowing the general facts of the Regency is not the same as actually knowing any of the details. Right. So when I finished writing a first draft of To Have and to Hoax, I went and read a couple of books, like cover to cover, that were all just sort of about daily life in the Regency and like kind of specifically what the life of an aristocrat was like. Because you need the, like, there's all these details you don't even realize that you need for things like what would the fabric of a dress she would wear during the day versus what she wore at night? Like what kind of parents would someone have? Like all these really small things. And I'm definitely not concerned with like, I mean, I think anyone who reads my books can tell that strict historical accuracy is not really my intention. And there are definitely times when I make a decision about something where I'm like, I know this is inaccurate and I'm going to deliberately be okay with that for the sake of a good story. There are obviously, like with all authors, occasionally there are things that sneak in that are just inaccurate, that are mistakes on my part. But yeah, and then with To Marry and to Meddle, since it's set in the theater world, I read a whole book about the history of theater in England, like the 400-year history of like British theater and stuff. Most of like which doesn't appear in the book at all, but it was still like it was a really interesting read, and B, it was just like nice to have that kind of like background knowledge going into it.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, because like I'm more of a just like an overall theme type of person. I don't pay attention at all to like what hemline would have been appropriate, because like I shared one of the new Bridgerton covers in a Regency group and they like, this is so inaccurate, she would have never worn that hemline, and I'm like, okay, I thought the cover was pretty.
I don't get that many readers emailing me telling me about the inaccurate occasionally, but I don't get it very much compared to a lot of Regency authors, because Regency readers are really meticulous and like they know a lot about the era because they read so widely within that genre and like they know the history of it. I think the fact that the tone of mine is a bit like deliberately modern possibly turns off that portion of the audience so much to begin with that they're not really my core reader base. I think I get a lot of readers who are kind of crossover readers from contemporary romance who are less likely to pinpoint things like someone having the wrong hemline or something.
That's a good point, because I think that yours was one of the first historical romances that I read. I'd have to look, but yeah, because I was more of like a rom-com contemporary, and it was just that cartoon cover. I know it's a controversy right now, the cartoon covers, but if it doesn't have a cartoon cover, I don't want it. Like that's what I like, are those illustrated covers. So
I like illustrated covers too,
love
obviously.
them.
Like
Yep, that's
I
what I'm
also
looking for in a
some of my
rom-com.
favorite romance novels don't have illustrated covers, and I love those ones too. I do think it was definitely a very deliberate decision with my book, since the like kind of both my agent and my editor kind of envisioned them all along was being sort of like straddling this line of like historical romance for contemporary romance readers. So yeah, it was definitely a very deliberate attempt to sort of signal like, oh, this is for you, even if you don't think you like historical romance, maybe try this and you might enjoy it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and your dialogue was so easy to follow. It wasn't like, that very old school, almost Austen, like where it's kind of hard to follow, like reads like a textbook. It's modern and fun to follow.
There occasionally will be things that will pop up either from my editor, from my copy editor, being like, what is this piece of Regency slang? There's always a moment where, like, sometimes I'll leave it in and sometimes I won't.
Yeah.
Like there was like I made an allusion to the waterfall, which is a really famous like nodding style for a cravat. And any like Regency reader, if you like a hardcore Regency reader, if you like reference the waterfall, they know what that is. But I like added more context surrounding that line because my editor is kind of like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's funny. So what is a day in your life like? Writing time.
Yeah, so I work part-time, so I have more writing time these days than I used to before I moved to Maine, which is nice. So like right now is a really good example because I'm on deadline. So like I'm writing like 7 days a week right now. So on one of my non-work days, I'm a morning person, so I try to get a lot of writing done. If I don't if I don't at least start writing like before 10 a.m. or so, it's like not a good sign for how my day is going. And I've started doing kind of like sprints. So usually I'll like get up, have breakfast, like go on a walk. And then I set timers. So I'll set a timer for like 30 minutes and write as much as I can in 30 minutes. And then I'll take a break and like play with my cat or like get on Instagram or something. And then I'll set a timer for another 30 minutes. And I tend to be a pretty fast drafter. So if I'm drafting, I'll just do a few of those and like, write 1,000 or 2,000 words and usually be done in the morning. When I'm in the late stages of a draft, like I am right now, where I'm kind of trying to polish it before I send it to my editor on Friday, I'm just doing these 30-minute sprints over and over and over again all day, basically. I have not left my house today yet. I've been outdoors. But yeah, and so having like more time to write and have these full days to devote to it since I moved up here and have scaled back my working hours has been really nice. On work days, I try to write in the morning before work. So I'll get up at like 5 and like have a cup of tea and try to I don't know, get in like 45 minutes or so of good work time. Cause if I leave it till after work, it has never gone for me. And when I worked full time, this is one of my only options. I had to write in the morning. So I'm kind of trying to hold on to that habit.
Yeah. So when you're writing, do you like to outline your story first, or you kind of like a pen to paper and let it see where it takes us?
Both.
Yeah.
Both. I feel like for years, I have convinced myself that I'm more of an outliner than I actually am. Like I've started with like the best intentions where I'm like, okay, here I am sitting down with my little outline. And the problem is I get about midway through an outline and I start to get really, really antsy and really want to start writing. Especially because I don't know, like no matter how much character work or outlining I do ahead of time, I still like writing the first draft is how I really get to know the characters. And so my outline is only so helpful because I can't outline down to sort of the scene by scene level. I just don't know how they're going to react in certain circumstances because I don't know them well enough. And I know some authors who are really intense outliners and they'll be like, I've been looking forward to writing this scene that I'm going to write today for 6 months. And I'm like, how? I don't understand. I will say with the book I'm writing right now, the 4th one, I had a more rigorous outline than I've ever had for any of the previous ones. Like I made myself sit with it and try to do as much outlining as possible. And while it definitely like the first draft has changed a lot from the outline, I have to say it did make things easier. I'm very disappointed to report that there might be something to this. But yeah, I'm kind of a hybrid, like plotter and pantser combined.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so if you happen to get writer's block, how do you work through that?
I don't. It's I had the Tamarian to Metal is the book that was by far the hardest for me to write of any of the three. Well, now I'm on the fourth one so far. For a lot of reasons. Part of it is because I started trying to write it in like May 2020 when it was not I was not feeling very
Right.
pretty and inspired, as I don't think anyone
Right.
was. But also Emily and Belfry, the two main characters in Tamarian to Metal, had been on page together a lot in the first two books, which was fun because it really kind of like made readers excited and me excited for them to finally get a book of their own, but also really presented a challenge because it was like, oh, I need to make sure everything I'm saying doesn't contradict something that I already said. And like I didn't know how much to explain what had already happened in the first two books because a romance novel is supposed to stand alone. So with that one, I really ended up like I would write 3,000 words, toss it out, like write, toss it out, write, toss it out, which was not great. And honestly, all that ever works for me when I feel stuck is just to try writing something anyways. And even if I end up tossing it out, just the act of putting something down on paper, even if it's garbage. I mean, that one, I think I tossed out 10 drafts before I finally landed on one that like I was actually able to finish.
Yeah.
It was really, really frustrating because it's a lot of wasted time. But if I hadn't been doing that, I would have just been sitting staring at my computer in frustration, which isn't helpful either.
Right.
But yeah, I usually just try to write something because maybe it'll like knock loose some idea or a single line of dialogue that I might actually be able to use. Like it's terrible. It sucks.
Now you were talking about how you still work part-time and then writing and your cat. Do you have much free time outside of that where you get to do any hobbies of your own?
It like depends on the time of year, honestly. Like March and April tend to be really busy for me because I'm both gearing up for the release of one book and on deadline for another one. So I feel like my poor friends, the number of invitations I've turned down recently where I'm like, nope, sorry, I gotta write. I tends to not have a lot of free time. And the summers when like I usually revise on a revision deadline in the early summer, but like later in the summer and in the fall, I tend to have more free time these days, so long as I've been on this like publication schedule with an April release. So, and it's been like this past summer and fall, I just moved to Maine. So I went hiking a lot and like kind of just exploring the city. I'm hoping to I want to take tennis lessons this summer. So yeah, I'm just kind of I've only been here for like 11 months. So I'm kind of like my hobby at the moment is just trying to like get out and like meet people and just kind of get to know, Maine and Portland more specifically. Cause like, I don't know how long I'll be up here. I really like it, but I don't know if it'll be like a permanent thing or not. So kind of just like want to like take advantage of living in this really cool place. And also the weirdest thing about becoming published is taking the thing that was your hobby and turning it into your job. And I feel like a lot of writers struggle with this, whereas for years people were like, what's your hobby? And I was like, oh, I write. And that's been my answer since I was a kid. And so for the past few years, it's like, well, that's not a hobby. That is something they pay you to do. That makes it a job. The fact that I would continue doing it, even if they stopped paying me to do it, doesn't make it not a job. It's like right now. So, yeah, I feel like it kind of causes a bit of this like identity crisis where you're like, what? Who am I?
Yeah, I used to ask people, do you have any other hobbies besides writing? And then one day I was like, that's incredibly offensive because these people are getting paid for that. That's not their hobby. So I started wording it differently.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, I still think, like, I'll, like, occasionally refer to it as work, and I'll be like, oh, no, I mean writing. And my friend is like, no, you were right to say work. That is work now. And I'm like, I know, but I don't like calling it that because it's not very, like, romantic. Like, I feel like you have this, like, romantic vision of the creative and, like, you know, doing it, like, the passion of their art and calling it work, I don't know, like, diminishes that in my mind, but also it is work. We should call it work.
Right. So how did you make like your big break when it comes to being publishing, or in the traditional publishing route?
So I wrote 2 different like YA manuscripts in my early to mid 20s, and I tried to query both of those and like had gotten a few nibbles, but hadn't like gotten an agent or anything. And then it was like right around the time I was graduating from library school, I started writing To Heaven to Hoax, and took like 2.5 years to get like a draft that I actually felt comfortable sending to an agent because I just kept like rewriting it over and over and over again. And then it was funny because after having like no luck with querying at all for like 2 books in a row, I only queried 5 agents before I signed with mine. Because I kind of like made a list, like I'd done some research, but then the right at the top of my list was an agency that I'd put on there because one of the agents repped Sally Thorne, who wrote The Hating Game. And when I read that book, which I read it like right when it came out, and it was one of the first contemporary romances that I really fell in love with, because prior to that I mainly read historicals. But I thought it was so funny. I made a note of who the agent was because I was like, I feel like we have similar taste, even though mine is a historical and this is a contemporary. So like 2 years later, when I was ready to look for an agent, I put her agency at the top of my list. I sent out like my first batch of just 5 queries. I wanted to see how those ones landed before sending out more. And in that first batch was Taylor Haggerty, who is Sally Thorne's agent, who works at Root Literary. And I queried that agency and I ended up signing with her. So
that's awesome.
And we did a little bit of revising, and then we took it out on submission to editors, and we had a couple of different houses who were interested, and then they couldn't get it through acquisitions because they didn't think that like historical rom-coms would sell, basically. Like they were all really gung-ho for contemporary rom-coms, and they didn't think it would like translate well into the historical space. I think that happened at 2 different houses. And then we had a third editor who didn't even bother taking it to acquisitions because even though she loved it for the same reason. And I was starting to be like, are they right? Like, is no one like, is this not a thing that's going to sell? But then we took it, Taylor sent it to my now editor at Atria, who like read it in a weekend and like loved it. And we had a phone call on a Wednesday, and then she made an offer on it on a Friday. It was like this total like whirlwind. I've been with that same editor ever since, and she's wonderful, so it all worked out.
Awesome. That's awesome. I love Atria. They're one of my favorite publishing houses.
Yeah, they're great, and they're doing a lot more romance now, which is like really fun. So like my editor, mainly thanks to my editor, like she has a couple of other romance authors like on her list as well, and so it's really fun.
Yeah. Well, they were sure wrong of the other ones, because now that Bridgerton has come out, I mean, our historical romance is all the rage. Like that's what people are looking for.
Whenever people like, especially like new authors, ask me for kind of advice about publishing, I'm like, listen, you just kind of need to accept how wildly unpredictable all of it is. Like my book, like sold in a preempt. It was very exciting. And then it came out 3 weeks into a global pandemic when all the bookstores were closed, which is like the worst release date ever. It's terrible luck. And that was really depressing. But then 9 months later, a Netflix adaptation of a 20-year-old book series caused unprecedented interest in the genre. So the point is just like, you can't predict anything like that. And so you kind of just have to like let go, and just like your job is to write the best book you can write. Like you can't control, like nothing I had done could have like controlled any of those things that affected the success of my first book or the later ones. It's made me very philosophical about the whole process.
That's funny. So you've already kind of told us about your favorite genres. What is your favorite book of all time? If you had to pick one.
If I had to pick one, I would cheat and pick a series, and it's actually a children's series.
That's totally fair.
It's The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. It's like this really classic children's fantasy series that was published in the 60s. One of them won a Newbery Medal. They're like high fantasy based on Welsh mythology. And like they're this perfect balance of like sort of fantasy adventure and also like really funny. It's like a really good example of how to, like in terms of craft, how to like do like make really good use of side characters for like comic relief and stuff. And there's like a romantic subplot that sort of slowly develops as the characters get older. And then also the later ones are like so sad that when I read the last one, I like curl up in the fetal position in my couch weeping to myself. No, I reread them every like 5 years or so, like even as an adult. And yeah, they're still my favorite.
I've not heard of those.
The Disney movie, The Black Cauldron from like the 80s or whatever, is based on one of the books in this series. And
I have heard of that.
So much better than the Disney movie. I really wish they would.
Yeah, that movie, I did not care for that movie.
No, it's not good. I really wish they would give this series a sort of like Netflix treatment because it's so wonderful.
Yeah. What are you currently reading, if you are?
I haven't been reading that much lately because I'm on deadline. I'm almost done. Actually, I have it right here. I'm almost done reading A Far Wilder Magic by Alison Saft, which debuted on the New York Times list. It like hit the list in its first week out a few weeks ago. It's YA fantasy about this sort of like mythical hunt. It's set in this like country that's sort of like Ireland-ish inspired. And there's a romance. It's really, really good. I like it a lot. If anyone has read the Scorpio races, I would say this is the best read-alike for the Scorpio races that I've ever read, honestly. And I've also been reading Julianne Long's Pennyroyal Green series, which is an 11-book long historical romance series that they're from like 10 years. They're from like 10 years ago. I just never gotten around to them. And I'm obsessed with them. I have been rationing them very slowly. I'm not letting myself binge them, and they are some of the best historical romances I have ever read. And I've read a lot of historical romance, but these ones are phenomenal. So
I've not read that many. I just recently got into the genre about a year ago ish. I've read some Lisa Kleypas, her Wallflower series. Well, I haven't finished them. I've read up to, I think I've read the first 3.
Oh, there's one more. Yeah.
Because they're like in the seasons, right? So I think I've read the first 3 of those. I might be on the last sister, the Bowman sister. And then I've read all but the last of the Ravenall series.
They're so good.
Which that last one, it doesn't really connect, like, because they're not really connected per se to the rest of the Ravenalls. So I'm not like rushing myself to read it. And then I've read the first 2 Bridgertons. And then yours.
You should try, if you haven't read any Tessa Dare yet, I highly
They're
recommend.
on my shelf.
Yeah, they're really funny. Like if you liked mine, hers are really, really funny also. So like she was one of my first authors that I read.
Yeah. Well, I also have read The Duke Undone.
Oh yeah, that's a really good one too.
Yeah, I've read that one of more recent. So fans of yours, you kind of just mentioned Tessa Dare. They might like that. Any other recommendations that people who have loved your books, what else might they love?
There was a one that came out last year by Virginia Heath called Never Fall for Your Fiance.
Yes. That one has a sequel coming out too.
Yeah, I have an arc of the sequel on my iPad right now. I just haven't gotten around to reading it yet.
They just sent it to me yesterday. That's how I know that.
I thoroughly enjoyed Never Fall for Your Fiance. It's also like, I don't know, I feel like it's a similar vibe to mine. It's very tongue-in-cheek. The author's actually British, so the humor is just like delightfully British and dry.
That's getting moved up then.
Yeah, it's very charming, like not too heavy or angsty or anything. So that would be one. Also, a like kind of classic historical romance author, who I feel like kind of diehard fans of the genre are well aware of, but newer readers might not be because she only publishes like every other year now. She's kind of a slow writer. Is Loretta Chase, who wrote one of the most famous romance books of all time, which is oh my gosh, no, Lord of Scoundrels, which was published in the 90s, but which is a trip, honestly. Like it's 25 years old, and I still highly recommend people reading it, both to understand kind of like where the genre is coming from, and also just because it still is like a delight. Even though some things about it are a little like, because it was 1995.
Doesn't age well.
But she's publishing newer stuff. Like her most recent series is called Difficult Dukes, and there are 2 of those out so far.
I think I bought that book. I only read the first chapter, like maybe where their sibling is getting married or something like that. Am I thinking of the right book?
Maybe.
I know I just bought a book by her within the last year.
She is a genius. Like truly, her banter is so funny, so clever. Like her books the premises are always like hysterical. Like she's so good. I love her so much. I always am like trying to get people to check her out because I know she's one that just because she doesn't publish as often, I think like newer readers might have missed
some of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are so many newer readers since 2020. Like we started our group in 2019 and like we had some really good growth. Like we were sitting at maybe like 1,000 followers or members. And then when 2020 hit, it was like every week we were getting about 100 plus members to where it was up to like, it's almost up to 12,000, I think, because of COVID.
Yeah.
Because people were bored and they were looking for something to do.
Yeah, totally.
They got back into reading. So,
I love it.
Yeah. So would you love it if your books were adapted?
I would, as I feel like would most authors. I feel like the odds of that happening are very, very slim, but it would be pretty cool. Even though people always ask me, they're like, well, who would you cast if that happened?
Yes.
And I have to confess, I don't picture faces clearly, either when I'm reading or when I'm writing. It's like I know what they look like. Obviously, I
Right.
describe their like physical features and everything. And it's not like it's a total blank over their face, but it's like it's ever so it's like if you needed glasses and you'd have your glasses on or something,
Yes.
where it's like ever so slightly blurred to the point that like I don't look at any actors and think like, oh, that's definitely who I would cast to play that person. Except my friend pointed out when I revealed the cover for To Marry and to Meddle, she pointed out that Julian looks kind of like the actor who plays Benedict Bridgerton on Bridgerton. And
He does.
ever since she pointed this out, I'm like, I think that's partially because you only see him in profile on the cover,
Yeah.
so you don't get like a full face effect also. But ever since she pointed this out, I'm like, I kind of could see this.
Yeah. Well, and then that he's artistic. He's an actor, and Bridgerton was a painter, so
yeah,
I can see that.
I
get to where I picture the same guy for like 5 books in a row, and then I'll switch to a different one. Like after I watched Bridgerton, for example, the Duke of Hastings was the Duke in every book I read for like.
That seems like great to me.
It is. And then like James Franco, he'll be a few for a while, and the guy who played in 50 Shades of Grey, he'll be a couple. But I pick the same guys over and over again. But then my girls are just like what you said. They're just kind of like glossed over. Yeah, they're there. They have some characteristics, but
I think it's just like, I don't know. I think part of it for me, I don't know why I never pictured faces when I was reading, but then when I was writing, like, I'm like, if I start picturing like an actor that they look like or something, it makes them not my character anymore. Right. Like it feels weird to me.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, but no, it's an issue when I'm reading too. And I'm just kind of like, whenever they announce like casting news for like an adaptation of a book I've read, if it's something that seems like really, really wrong, I can tell you that. I'm like, no, that's definitely wrong. But like, otherwise, I'm kind of like, oh, sure, this seems fine. Yeah. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, did you see where I think it's Persuasion is going to be made into a Netflix, and they have cast Dakota Johnson as her. So that'll be interesting to see.
Love Persuasion, and we need more adaptations of it, so I'm very excited about this. Though I saw that's the one that they cast Henry Golding in, and he's not playing Captain Wentworth, which feels like a waste to me because he is one of the most attractive men I've ever seen. So I'm like, why would you not cast him in this? Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah. So we'll see. I hope like my friend Sarah, she said, well, I hope her British accent is not terrible. So I guess we'll see.
We will.
And then you've already answered my question on what are you currently working on. So I was so happy to hear we get 2 more.
Yeah, and the 4th one comes out next April, as far as I know, as of right now, unless they change it later. And it's called To Swoon Into Spar, and it's about, like I said, Pinvale, and the heroine is a new character.
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, it's the first time I've written like a new character as one of the protagonists, like since the very first book. So it's been fun. And the basic premise of this one is that he's a viscount whose like a family, like ancestral estate was unentailed from the title. So when his parents died, it was sold off to his uncle to cover like some debts. And he's been trying to like buy it back ever since. And this has kind of been alluded to like in casual mentions in the first few books. So the premise of To Swoon Into Spar is that like his uncle comes to him and is like, I will sell the house back to you finally if you marry this ward that I have that I'm kind of just desperate to get off my hands. And Pinvale's like, okay, yeah, sure. Fine. He agrees to it. So he like meets with her and she's like, yeah, sure, let's get married. So they get married and they like go off to the little like estate in Cornwall, and they get there and Pinvale's like, this is strange. The house seems to be haunted. What will be immediately apparent to the reader and will only slowly become apparent to Pinvale is that Jane, his new wife, is the one actually doing the haunting because she wants to get rid of him so she can just live in her nice little seaside estate by herself and like scare him off back to London.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Why do I get Jane Eyre vibes? Like
so
that?
Yes. You're not the first person who said that. It's actually more like Northanger Abbey vibes, I would say, because it's kind of a little bit of like a spoof of a Gothic novel. Yeah.
Well, as soon as you said ward, that kind of like it kind of put me there, like thinking of her being when Jane was his ward and his like governess. and that kind of put me in that. And then when you were like the haunting of the house, I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, like Gothic novels are really popular in the time of the Regency, which is why Jane Austen wrote Northanger Abbey
Yeah.
like as a Gothic novel spoof because it was such a popular trend.
I love
So I kind of
this.
like pitched it to my agent as like a spoof of a Gothic novel, like Northanger Abbey, only like not as good because I'm not Jane Austen, but like the same general idea. Although I feel like it's maybe less obvious of a spoof because the Gothic novels were really, really popular when she wrote that book. I feel like to modern audiences now, it's like they're not such a like cultural behemoth the way they were
Right.
back then. But no, it's a very fun premise. It's kind of silly. It's fun
I
a lot.
love it. No, I'm so excited for this.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, that'll be so fun. All right. Well, I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I can't wait to read these next couple of books. If you haven't read her series yet, we really did not give any spoilers at all. So go back and get those. I suggest, even though they're standalones, I definitely suggest reading them in order. So you have that almost nostalgic feeling when you pick up book 2. You kind of already know and get the feeling. So yeah, I really appreciate. And now that you said that's coming back out in April, we're gonna have to do this again next year.
Yeah, totally.
So all right, well, thank you so much, and
Thank you.
I will definitely be in touch with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.